Hi, I wanted to make a video on what happened to the radial arm saw. Now, look, a lot of people who do talk about a radial arm saw. I bought this radial arm saw new around the year 2000, and that's right in the era when radial arm saws were disappearing. And I always wondered, why the saw is disappearing. And I've heard reasons why people say it's disappearing, but I don't believe in those particular reasons. One of the reasons is some people say that the saw is dangerous because of the climb cut. And I won't go too much into the climb cut because plenty of people have talked about it. But just in general, the way the saw spins, it's pushing the work down into the table and into the fence, which is exactly what you want. You don't want it to throw the lumber at you, which a table saw will. But it will cause the saw to pull out. Now, this particular saw actually has a motor and a wire that actually controls the speed of the pull out, so you can't really do it on this particular cut. So they were addressing that particular issue. Now, I did use a saw back when I was in high school. I was like 14 years old, and it was very easy to stall the saw by pulling it too fast. Now, that was a DeWalt saw, and that motor was much less powerful than this one. And so what would happen is the saw would just kind of stall out. So it wasn't, necessarily a super dangerous thing. But the other thing is the posture of this is you typically have your hand on here and you're holding the lumber against the fence. So when you pull it out, you're not really in the cutting path of the particular saw. Now, wouldn't want it to startle you, but just in general, every saw has its own particular dangers. Now, of course, you take the table saw. I find this the most dangerous saw in the shop, and the reason is because the blade is typically exposed. You see a lot of people saying leave your guards and things on there, and I typically did. I later converted this to have a riving knife, which I find makes the saw a lot more safe. This is an old DeWalt saw. In Europe, it was sold with a riving knife, and if you knew someone in Europe, you used to be able to get parts and you could convert it, which is what I did, which is why I don't typically run with that there. But you see people constantly reaching their hands over the blade and very near the blade, which I find incredibly dangerous. And the other thing is kickback, because where does this saw want to do? It wants to push the lumber that way and up. So just in general, you want to actually have it controlled. So you either have to have push blocks, or I'll use feather boards and things like that to kind of control those. So just in general, having both these saws for over 20 years, I've ever had more close calls on this saw than this saw. So I don't think it's necessarily a safety issue. Now, accuracy is one of the reasons too that they find the saw not very accurate. I'm going to do a video on that. Now, I have to say there's a lot of degrees of freedom, so you have to control all of those. But that's, as a hobbyist woodworker, tinkering is one thing. So as long as you get that dialed and it's not there. But I think the primary reason that this saw went away is this saw. Now, this is your compound miter saw. And I will say, what does this saw have going for it? It is cheap. So this saw, even in 2022, I saw it on sale at Christmas time for $200. Now, this is a $125 blade on a $200 saw. This saw, I probably paid, somewhere around $700 for it 20 years ago. So just in general, they've got a ton of the cost out of it. And it is incredibly well designed. So what you see is what I really like about this saw is the blade is perfectly in line with the arm. It's unlike here where there's a bit of a torque here on the saw. So if you pile up too much of it, it'll lift up a little bit and will cause some inaccuracies there, where they kind of avoid that. On top of it, if you take a look at this saw, I'm just swinging the arm back on that. If I take a look at this saw, it's probably another 6 inches out from the post. So there's when you get it really out on the arm, there's a lot where that arm has a fair amount of weight, so it can kind of lift up a little bit. Now, having there, if you kind of come back down the cut, it should kind of level out, so it doesn't cause as much inaccuracies. But here, I love this one because it's simple. It's just chop, and I actually like the chop a lot better than a slide. Now, people are going to sliding miter saws, but you know what they're really getting back to is this saw. So you know, there's the Festool saw that even has a stop on it. So you can actually do one of the best things on a radial arm saw, which I think is, you know, my favorite thing. And if you look at this, I actually have a dado blade set up on it because I find it like probably the one, dados and rabbits. This, and you know, just hogging stuff out. Of course, it's a little faster if you've got a dado blade on here. Your climb cut can be more, your climb can be a little more severe on it though. That, you know, you could pull out of that, but you know, slowly the compound miter saw is moving back to this. Now, having said that, I do think there are definite improvements in there. But if you take a sliding compound miter saw, you still have to be cognizant of the climb cut. You have to know how to run that. So you have to pull the saw out, push it down, and then push it forward. And if you don't, you're going to run into the same potential issue with the climb cut and the same, you know, considerations for a particular blade. So I actually like this one because the motor's directly in line with the blade, and the chop is super simple. And you know, this, even I have zero clearance fences on this thing, but you know, 6 inches is typically more than enough for 95% of the cuts, which is probably why this saw, being so expensive, got replaced by this saw, because this offered a lot of flexibility, but this saw did 99% of what typical people wanted to do with this saw, and why, you know, it's kind of gone away. But I don't know, I still find this the most fascinating saw in the shop, and I do think there's some, I'll probably, I'll try to do some videos on some of the things I've done on this, but I don't know, I'm fascinated by the radial arm saw. Anyway, hope those arguments maybe, you know, fight the thing that, you know, the reasons why this saw went away. But if you know, if you can get access to one of these, I don't know, I think they're nice saws.